Hey, good afternoon again. Welcome to the panel, Clawing Back the Truth, What Matters in 2023. So you guys know me from this morning's event. You don't know the two co-panelists that I'm with. So let me do some quick introductions. I'm sitting here with two of my very favorite human beings and, more importantly, writers in the known universe. Joan Walsh, I've known for probably the better part of a decade. She's got a resume that I could spend an hour talking about, but that would bore you to death, so I'm not going to do that. But very briefly, she's got a storied career as a TV commentator. She's a book author. She was the editor-in-chief of Salon magazine, and she's now the national correspondent for The Nation. Joining her is Elie Mystal, who's the justice correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's the author of the wonderful book, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, and he's also one of the best raconteurs I've ever met, because Elie really does not hold back, as I'm sure he'll show you today. The most important qualification for both of them is that they are my fellow sailors on the Nation cruise, where your great-great-grandparents come to be entertained some summers and some winters. Anyways, with that, today's talk is going to be basically about stories that should be being covered, but that aren't necessarily getting the traction that they maybe should have in parts of the press or the cable news networks and so on. But before I sort of go into that, I think the more important question to start with is what should be covered? What is being covered? Maybe not as well as we'd like, but what are the stories that are just so big at the moment that for you both, in the areas that you cover, you couldn't look yourself in the mirror if you weren't writing about them? And I think I want to start with you, Joan. What are the issues at the moment that are just bone-shakingly important?
I mean, I wake up every morning, Sasha, and find another horrible set of state laws banning abortion at earlier and earlier times. And also a set of stories talking about women who've been basically, set out to die, set out to be sick, set out to just wait until something happens where doctors in their state can take care of them. And so those stories are being covered, but I feel like those of us all across the nation, small towns, big cities, we need to be looking out for them. Voting rights, I mean, the red states, you could do just like, I'm sure somebody has, like an overlay of, the red states against voting rights and abortion. Voting rights, they just keep passing awful voting rights laws. And also since, thank you, Donald Trump, they are all on board, at least the red states, with there is all this voter fraud, and therefore we're going to, take over voting boards of election. I mean, what they did in Harris County, Texas, the Houston county seat, is just unbelievable.
So let me interrupt a minute. Talk more about Harris County, because I know a lot of our students are going to know about that, but a lot of them won't. And this, to my mind, is one of the most, just shocking stories of the moment, what happened there recently.
Well, they just decided that they could change who made decisions, and they could conceivably, I mean, I'm not sure they absolutely can do it. I have to say, I always, give them an out, but they can change who makes decisions about what votes count and what really happened. And they seem to have put it in the hands of Republicans.
And the they being the state legislatures.
Right. The Republican state legislature ruling over a hugely Democratic and always growing more Democratic county. So those are the kind of things. And, I know that as a national reporter looking at national stories, but I feel like everyone listening, watching here with us might have a story like that in their hometown or their county. It's just unbelievable. Even in some blue states, they're doing things like that. So those are two things that I think are really important to keep on.
Yeah, and I'm glad we open with this, because obviously there's a million things to write about in this world, not just domestically, but globally. There's war and peace issues, there's global environmental issues, there's issues of economic justice and injustice and so on. But certainly domestically, when you look at what's happening, if you're a journalist at the moment, there are these sort of almost existential issues. You know, they transcend issues of day-to-day politics or day-to-day economics, and they become issues about what kind of a society we are 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Are we a democracy?
You know, yeah, whether we stay a democracy, whether we become even more of an autocracy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, you know, certainly from my perspective, these are issues that, you know, every day I'm getting up and I'm thinking, well, how do I cover these stories in a way that's going to resonate with people who aren't necessarily sort of versed in the issues in the same way? How do I make them explainable? And I want to move on to you, Elie, on this. You have a law degree from Harvard. You've got this absolutely stellar background, understanding the way the Constitution does work or is supposed to work. And then on a daily basis, you're trying to communicate to an audience that doesn't have a Harvard law degree necessarily why these things are important. So for you, what are the sort of critical issues of the day, and how do you communicate them to a lay audience that doesn't share your legal background knowledge?
Yeah, well, this question is easy for me, Sasha, because my entire beat is undercovered. Right? I cover the Supreme Court, which is one of the 3 co-equal branches of government. According to them, they think they're the most important branch of government because they run around stomping around this country like they own the place, right? They seem to think they have a veto over anything, any act of Congress, over any act of the Biden administration, and they're using it, and almost nobody is paying attention, right? If you just look at the kind of reporters, the amount of reporters that we have, that we deploy to cover Congress, right? It's diverse, it is large, it is whatever. If you look at the number of reporters we deploy to cover the executive branch, specifically the president, I mean, as we saw this week, Joe Biden cannot trip over a sandbag without 8,000 reporters and cameras and people and whatever looking around. This week, the Supreme Court eviscerated the right to strike, just took an entire shot at the basic labor right to strike. And me, a couple other people were on it, but like wasn't the lead of the nightly news, right?
All right, so let's talk about that, because you're absolutely right. That decision was scandalously underreported in every venue. I mean, cable news, it's a given they underreport complicated stories, but even the New York Times and the Washington Post, you had to search to get some information on this. So it's a fair bet that no matter how well read the members of this audience are, many of them just haven't encountered details about what you're talking about. So explain it a little bit more. What happened? Why is it important? And as a journalist, how do you cover something like this? How do you sort of inject it into the national discourse?
Right. So the Teamsters Union walked out on the job, right? There were Teamsters who were working for a concrete cement mixing company, walked out on the job. They showed up to work. They poured the cement into their trucks. They went off to make their cement deliveries. And at the appointed time, after negotiations broke down, they stopped the deliveries. They drove the trucks back to the lot and they walked out. Well, if you know anything about cement, it tends to dry. And when it dries, it tends to harden. And when it hardens in the trucks, it tends to break the trucks. And that did happen in some cases. Well, after the strike was over, the cement company sued the Teamsters Union for economic damages caused by the strike. Folks, every strike causes economic damages. That is literally the point of a strike, right? And even though I think most people understand if you walk out on the job, you can't set fire to the building on your way out. There are limits in what you can do within the bounds of striking. Most people understand that like causing economic harm to your employer is in fact the point of a strike. And if you can later sue the labor union or the workers for damages for the economic loss caused by the strike, you kind of don't have the right to strike anymore. And the Supreme Court 8-1 kind of took the company's side and said that, oh, because they mixed the concrete and then left, they caused the harm and they could be, the Teamsters Union could be sued for this. Now, so that's what happened. In terms of explaining it, think about how I just explained it to you guys, right? The right to strike was what was taken away. I didn't lead with the legal jargon about how the NLR, the National Labor Relations Act, interposes with the National Labor Relations Board and how that causes federal preemption. all of that is part of the case. All of that was there. All of that is an important part of the legal story for how this happened. But you don't start with the jargon. You don't start with the technicalities. You start with what happened. And so one of the ways that I try to explain to young journalists, to people who, a lot of whom don't have a law degree, how to start covering the courts and the third branch of government that, again, acts like it's the most powerful, is to never lead with the law. Because even me, with the law degree, I try not to lead with the law. The law is complicated and boring. And often, if you lead with the law, you're missing the point. So kind of think about covering the Supreme Court the same way a person who is not a rocket scientist would think about covering NASA, right? You don't lead with, well, the trajectory of the eagle was at 18 aperture of the degree. You don't lead with that. You lead with, they landed on the fucking moon. Right. And then now everybody is set. OK, we're on the moon. That's the story. And then you kind of discuss how they got to the moon, which is an interesting narrative. Right. That's how I cover the court. We start with where they ended. Right. They killed the right to strike earlier this week. They killed the Clean Water Act. Later this month, they're going to kill affirmative action. They're going to eat all of these rights. And when I cover it, we're going to start there. And I will backfill the legal jargon in as needed, just to the extent that people need to understand how the court is going about eviscerating these basic laws and these basic rights.
Okay, so I want to come back to you, Joan. So, Elie, when you're talking about these rights being taken away, you're talking about a really unpleasant story, and you have to communicate just how unpleasant it is to an audience. Now, Joan, you write about a lot of unpleasant stories, that I know, but you also write about a lot of hopeful stories. You write about a lot of activists on the ground. You write about a lot of political movements that gain momentum. You write about progressive candidates who come out of nowhere sometimes and, surprise people. And sometimes the positive stories are just as hard to communicate effectively as the negative stories, maybe sometimes harder because they may be more complicated. So in the same way as Elie sort of doesn't lead with the law, but he leads with the moonshot, when you're doing a positive story, how do you communicate the import of that story to an audience unfamiliar with the nitty-gritty on-the-ground details?
That's a great question. I think that I always start with why he or she, and it's mainly she in my case, because I really do love writing about women who are running, and especially the women who began running in 2017 after they were appalled by Donald Trump. I start by why they're running and what they're doing and what they're learning. And then, we had some great victories in Virginia in 2017 and 2019 off-year elections where, they made a huge jump in the House of Delegates, and then they took the House of Delegates and the Senate, and it was just so magical. And 2018 was great too. But then it's really interesting, and I still think about this a lot because I'm trying to figure out how to get back in and cover it this summer, fall. All of that energy against Donald Trump and against what we had gone through, I don't want to say it dissipated totally, but it didn't really continue. And so now you have people who made these great leaps, whether they won and kept their seats or they won and lost their seats, or they're still trying to win their seats, trying to figure out how do you do this, every 2 years, because that's what they have to do, right? In a state legislature, they have to do it every 2 years. And so I started with the inspiration of these great people, mainly women. And now I'm trying to hang in there with the reality of it's not easy, even once you win, even once Joe Biden wins. We Democrats, and I will say that because I am a Democrat, we lost a lot of seats in legislatures and in a few in Congress. And 2022 wasn't much better. So I'm challenged myself having gone from being super, super encouraged by the backlash to Donald Trump in 2017, 2018, 2019, to then trying to figure out, where'd all those people go, especially the women? Did they come back in 2022? Some did. So I start with what inspires me. I do, at this point. I guess I always have. But then if you're really going to hang in there, you've got to continue with what is not inspiring and is kind of disappointing, and what the reality is in terms of holding on to various houses of, delegates, Senate in individual states, as well as, Congress, the House and Senate in Washington. And, I think a lot of reporters are either there for the big whoop, the big, whoa, this is happening, it's so great, or else, and, this is mainly our mainstream media who, we all periodically go off against. They're there for the big disappointment. Like, oh, Democrats thought they got Virginia, but then they lost Virginia, and that means they just lost, and they're going to just keep losing. Or they lost the House, which is, ask me a question about this if you want to, which is because the New York Democratic Party in 2022 was so freaking horrible. It cost the entire country its freedom. But there's so many reporters who are just into coming out against, being super negative about the possibility for change. They like the change at first, and then they're like, oh, well, that really wasn't change. That didn't really matter. And I just try to keep myself honest, obviously hoping for change, but also if there's a backtracking, what caused it? So I think that's a lot of what we're called upon to do as reporters. You get inspired, and then, sadly or not, explain why things we thought would happen didn't happen.
So let me build on that for both of you. So part of journalism is obviously reactive. So in Elie's case, part of your job, there's a Supreme Court ruling, it goes one way, it goes another way, you have to interpret it. That's a reactive story. Same thing with you, Joan. Part of it is, well, Georgia did this or Virginia did this, and then you interpret it. Or, there was a referendum that surprised people because abortion rights were protected, and then you interpret it. And that's all really important. But one of the things that all three of us do as journalists and as commentators is we're not just reactive, we're also always scouting around, where's another story, what's going on the margins that might become a big important story. What political figure don't we know today, but pretty certain we will know about in 2 or 3 years? And how do you get ahead of the curve? And so sort of moving the conversation a little bit towards the topic, clawing back the truth, what matters in 2023. If you're trying to get ahead of the curve, if you're trying to sort of look in your crystal ball and you're trying to think, all right, what's going to be the stories for the next year and a half in the lead up to the 2024 election? What are the issues that are going to motivate people? What are some of the ideological disputes that are going to motivate people? Where are some of the flashpoints politically or judicially? Open up your crystal ball a moment for these young and impressionable journalists who are watching us. Let's start with you, Elie. What do you think's coming down the pipeline that may not be getting a lot of attention right now?
It's a tough question because two things. One, I don't like the horse race coverage, right? And so like coverage that like as we sit here in the summer of 2023, kind of predicting what's going to be relevant 6 weeks before the election, that is just beyond the powers of my crystal ball. Part of it is because Americans are, what's the word I'm looking for? I think the scientific word phrase is they have the attention span of a goldfish. So like, whatever is the most recent thing that happened is the thing that people are going to care about, 5 days before the election. I have no idea what that's going to be because of the nature of our country, right? So part of the answer to the question is that when I'm trying to get ahead of the curve, it's almost like, how do you define the curve, right? Because the curve that I'm trying to get ahead of is not the curve that CNN is trying to get ahead of, right? It's not the curve that the Nates are trying to get ahead of with their polling data. I'm not concerned about that kind of stuff, right? The curve that I'm trying to stay abreast of is, and again, I kind of look at this from a rights perspective, like, what are they taking away next? Like, what are they coming for next, right? The one of the reasons why people like me and Joan were able to tell people for years about what was going to happen in Dobbs and how the Supreme Court was going to take away abortion rights is because they had been telegraphing what they were going to do for a very long time. And while people would act like me and Joan and others were hysterical, were chicken littles on this issue, that they were never actually going to take away abortion rights. No, yeah, they were, and they said so, right? So to kind of pull it all together, one of the things that I have found in my travels is that Republicans are actually pretty good at telling you exactly how they're going to hurt you next. They like to call their shot. They like to say, this is what we've taken this, and this is what we're going to take next year.
So it sounds like you're saying if you're a young journalist and you want to write about the law, you want to write about the judiciary and so on, you don't need a crystal ball. All you need to do is read conservative journals, go to conservative judicial conferences, go places where those strategies are being mapped out at the moment. And
believe them when they tell you. But when Clarence Thomas writes, the right to privacy can also be about the right to marriage and the right to contraception, but not the right to interracial marriage. Believe that what he's coming for next is contraception and the right to marry. Like, believe it, because he is, right? When Neil Gorsuch says that he thinks that the administrative state shouldn't exist, believe him that what he's coming for next is the EPA or the NLRB or any other executive agency that you can think of. When Ron DeSantis says that he can kidnap immigrants and send them off to other places against their will, believe that if he is president, that is exactly what he'll do. These people do not have the artifice to hide their policies, really. They're going to do what they say they're going to do. And so when you talk about getting ahead of the curve, the thing that I try to do is to listen to what they say, believe that they're telling the truth about what they intend to do, and then just try to explain to people how they're going to do it and how it's going to come from. Because the where there is a bit of artifice, where there is a bit of hiding the ball, is that they say what they're going to do, but they don't tell you how. And I feel like a lot of times it's my job as a journalist, as a columnist, to tell you how they're going to make good on the threats that they make all the time.
Yeah, and Elie, when you're saying believe them, I can't stress that enough. I mean, when we, the three of us, I think, were all warning about what would happen if Trump got elected, way back in 2015. I know The Nation put me on the Trump beat in early 2015 in the, assumption that this guy was, gonna make a mess of the election and, cause chaos in the country. And very few magazines or newspapers at the time were giving Trump much credence. But my sort of working modus operandi on that was, if you have a demagogue pandering to an audience that sort of is craving authoritarian answers, you better damn well know what those authoritarian proposals are, because he's going to try and enact them. So when Trump talked about Muslim bans, when he talked about building a border wall, when he talked about locking up his enemies, et cetera, my working assumption was, don't treat that as hyperbole, because if you do, you're going to miss the most important story of the early 21st century, or maybe the entire 21st century, which is the implosion of the American political process towards autarkic government. So Joan, coming to you, you've got, and again, I don't want to play horse race. You know me well enough to know I'm not asking a horse race question.
No, I know.
But you are a national correspondent. You write a lot about politics. You write a lot about political trends. You write a lot about movements that are growing or not growing. And you're obviously seeing things that a lot of journalists without your expertise are missing. You're seeing things and you're identifying trends that, a casual reporter on a regional newspaper or national newspaper may not have the skills or the insight to really grapple with. What are you seeing at the moment in 2023 America that sort of gives you a sense of where we're heading? What kinds of stories do you think, and what kinds of issues do you think are sort of coming down the pipeline based on what you're seeing and hearing at the moment?
I still go back to 2015, and I think it was the day after Trump came down that escalator that Dylan Roof murdered the wonderful people in Charleston, South Carolina. And I think that back then, I guess I'll say we, even though I don't think we did it, but we have been dealing with an incredible explosion of right-wing white supremacy that Trump completely legitimated, and it's still going on. And so, I get really, I do, Elie and I talk about this. I cover the horse race so he doesn't have to. And he, is going to buy me dinner or something, because I do that. But, I do it because it's still so fascinating that all these people are getting in the race. And when everyone knows the only way to defeat Trump is to have it be head on head with somebody. I mean, Ron DeSantis is not the guy, sadly for him. But it's just, we're going back to 2015, 2016. It just doesn't feel that different to me, even though it should be. And so I try to wake up and tell myself to look at something different, look at some other story. And I do, you will both vouch for me that I do periodically find other stories, but I also find myself just sucked into the horse race, because even though there are all these Republican leaders who say they want to stop Trump and they are going to, figure out how to do that, they're not going to do it. There are just, what are there, like at least 5 declared candidates right now, and, 3 more about to declare in the next week, and a couple more after that. It's going to be the same thing. And I hate to say it, but it matters, because he could win. I don't think he'll win, but he could win. And I think that I feel like I'm still stuck covering that.
All right. Listen, I want to move this one. We're halfway through our panel, and I'm looking on the Google Doc that Peter's feeding me, and there are lots and lots of questions coming in. And I do want to make sure that I get as many of them as possible. I probably won't get to all of them. So if you're out there in the audience listening and I don't call your name, your question, I apologize in advance. But I will get to as many as I can. And I want to open with one from Molly Simler. And this is a sort of nuts and bolts mechanical aspect of story writing. And Molly writes, any story can have lots of facets. It's important to lead with the story. But what if it isn't easy to decide that lead? How do you decide the quote unquote story? So coming back to both of you, you have this mountain of material to sift through. Maybe you've interviewed dozens of people for your story. You've read loads of documents. How do you decide what the centerpiece is, what the central focus is? Elie, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, 2 ways. One, I look at what I just think is most important, right? Like if you've got multiple different angles and multiple different ways of looking at it, I try to think of the one that is most important, and I define most important by going to have the biggest impact on whatever, on whether it's the election, whether it's a law, whether it's just how people treat each other. I try to think about the angle or the facet that's most important. But then I also kind of meld that with what I want to be talking about. There's what I kind of objectively think about what's most important, and there's what I subjectively think is most important. Great if they're together, that's awesome. But even if they're not, I'm going to make sure that I'm a columnist, right? I'm going to make sure that my subjectivity is in there as well. I'm going to talk about what I think we should be talking about, and the aspect and the angles that I think are super important. And in terms of like I know a lot of people, oh, well, that's you infecting your stories with your bias. You think? You know, I've got a perspective. I have a thing that I want to say, right? And so all I try to do is to make sure that my bias is out front, right? So the readers can assess for themselves whether or not they think that the bias is influencing the story, right? So if I'm a great example of this is, you know, when I had to do all of the coverage around the various horrible corruption scandals from Clarence Thomas. I also hate Clarence Thomas. I think most people who read me know that I hate Clarence Thomas. I think he is one of the most evil people in the last 50 years of American law and politics. Okay. And he's also super unethical, right? And I felt no problem kind of carrying both truths through the story. We can talk about what he did. We can talk about the seriousness of what he did. We can talk about, you know, and I did talk about putting that in the context of other corruption scandals. Is this better? Is this worse? Where does it fail? We can do all of that objectivity, but I never lose the fact that he's also like an evil master and has a history of doing this kind of evil, corrupt stuff. And that should be, to me, that was part of the story too, right? And I just, the last thing I'll say, Molly, is that I trust my readers, like a lot. I trust my readers that if I give them all of the information they need, they can make their own decision about the validity of my point or the subjectivity of my argument.
So can I jump in?
Yeah, you can. But Joan, what I would very much hope on this answer is, I know you do both columns and also reported pieces, but if you could focus on the reported pieces side of the equation here for how you sort of filter out all the information.
You know, I am really blessed by the Nation because I write reported pieces. And if I can't really get a bead on what the reported piece is really supposed to be doing, I can write opinion pieces and you know, I'm not saying they're easy, but sometimes they are easy. Sasha and Elie, you both know, it's like some things write themselves. But I'm working on something right now that is a reported piece, and it's really freaking hard. But what I have liberated myself to do, which I think I've done it before, and I think it is helpful, and I hope it will be helpful to Molly and others, is just write what you think is important. I mean, you're not writing for your editor, you're not writing for, you know, your coworker, you're not writing for anybody but yourself. Just write down, this is really what is staying with me. This is what I can't forget. This is what I, you know, bar nothing, this has to be said. And that as an exercise, it's not, you know, if you're on deadline, don't try that. You know, if you've got like a half hour or, you know, an hour to do something, maybe not, but maybe 5 minutes. I don't know. It has worked for me many times over the years, and it is working for me. I pray now because I had a good couple of days, but I think you've just got to, you know, as a writer, make peace with what you believe, what you've learned, what you know, what you want to say, and just play with it for a little while. And, you know, when you're farther along in your career, you might not have to do that, but I still have to do it every, you know, few stories. So I'm still not grown.
All right. I want to stick with you, Joan, because I've got a question coming in from someone from a junior in high school called Isabella Edgehill. And Isabella's question is this: I'm interested in politics and covering politics in a meaningful way, but I'm a junior in high school. Do I need to be a political expert to bring insight to the topic as a journalist? And I'm hoping you can give her a pep talk and tell her to go right ahead.
Go right ahead. My God. I mean, I didn't major in either journalism or political science. I was a student journalist. I was the co-editor in chief. That's how we did it back in the day, of my high school paper. I really just loved to write and loved to report and loved to tell the truth, and, you know, sometimes loved to stick it to our principal at the time. And then I went to college, and I started out in journalism, but I didn't stay with it. And I went into political science, and I didn't stay with that. So I went to American history. And I'm not saying that is what you should do. I'm just saying you really don't have to do anything in those, veins. You just have to find something that you are passionate about and do it and learn about it, and then come to journalism. I'm a huge advocate of write for your college paper, but a lot of colleges don't have papers anymore, which is so depressing. But if they
can I hop in?
Yeah.
Isabella, expertise comes later. Expertise is like the last thing to come.
Yeah, I still don't have it, Ellie. You do. I don't.
I'm still in the learning phase. And one of the highlights I like to use here is a friend of mine named Kashmir Hill. She's right now one of the lead privacy tech reporters at the New York Times. But I knew her when she was, a part-time employee and then eventually a full-time employee at Above the Law, writing kind of legal gossip stories with me, right? She didn't she didn't have a law degree, but she was interested in journalism, so she was writing these stories. And as kind of she went on, she realized that privacy law was kind of interesting. And this is like in the late 2010s, actually late aughts, really. She started saying, talking about being ahead of the curve, kind of understanding that, how we deal with technology, how privacy, the ways technology can invade our privacy is going to be kind of the battle of the next 50 years, and developed her expertise in privacy kind of on the job. And now she's at the New York Times, one of the foremost experts on privacy law with absolutely no legal training. So expertise comes when you do what Joan says and you marry your passion with just the rote experience of doing it, and then you'll find your expertise as you go.
Yeah, and if I can sort of add a third voice on this one, look, I think to write coherently and intelligently about politics, you have to love politics, but that doesn't mean you have to be an expert. You don't have to have read every political theory book out there or every political scientist out there. It means you have to have an understanding that politics impacts people's daily lives. And to everybody on this panel, that's probably a given. I teach at a university in California, and sometimes I have students from all over the campus. Some of them are scientists, some of them are in politics, some of them are engineers. But I do have a number of students every year who just aren't interested in politics, and they don't understand why it impacts them. And I have this conversation. I'm like, look, forget about journalism, forget about writing. Let's just have a conversation about taxation, or about war and peace, or about the environment, or about all these things that impact you on a daily basis. Does it matter? And, when people start thinking about it, they realize pretty quickly, well, of course, politics matters because it impacts so many aspects of our lives. You can argue it impacts every aspect of our life. Joan and Elie have been talking about Supreme Court rulings that, down the road could limit the right to contraception. Well, everybody pretty much at some point in their life uses contraception. There are just very, very basic things where if you absent yourself from understanding about the political process, you become a passive player. And so what I'd say to you, Isabella, is, follow your passions on this. And as Elie said, the expertise comes later. If you have the interest, you will develop the expertise. But I want to come to another question that is sort of tied in with this. And Joan, you mentioned, which I didn't know, you mentioned that you were a history major. This is a question from John Tafigi. And he writes that Katrina vanden Heuvel began the conference by emphasizing the importance of using historical context and understanding to fuel good journalism. Joan and Elie, I'm curious about your opinions on the intersection of history and journalism, and how journalism can educate people on American history while practically informing readers about current events. And I think this is a fabulous question because, to my mind, if you don't have that grounding in history, you're always going to be floating on a surface, an unstable surface. And history gives you that grounding. I don't mind which of you starts. Maybe, Joan, since you mentioned the word history in your last answer, why don't you start on this? How important is an understanding of history for the work that you do?
It's hugely important. And, I think that you have to start, if you have nothing else, if one has nothing else, it's the history of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and it's the history of Jim Crow, because that's what we're still living with. We're living with everything. We're living with all sorts of things, the founders ideas about guns, which were not what these gun assholes say they were. There are so many things, but I just have always come from a perspective of, what we did wrong about race and what we keep getting wrong. And when you go to Reconstruction and the attempts to make things right that got, not just shut down, but violently shut down. And you go to Jim Crow, and then you go to the civil rights movement and the white backlash to the civil rights movement in the 60s. You can't understand. You can't even read a newspaper today without understanding all of what happened in those periods, because so sadly, we are still dealing with all of that backlash and all of that ignorance and all of that fear. I'm just going to say, a nice kind word for the scared white people. They feel fear. Okay. But it's just so profound that is really where we are. And, a lot of it is because I don't know how we did it, but we elected the black guy in 2008, and we have never recovered from that. And that's what made me go back to not just, the civil rights movement, not just Jim Crow, but also to Reconstruction, because, yeah.
Yeah, look, Joan and I do a lot of cable news, and there is a lot of things wrong with cable news, but I think one of the biggest wrong things about cable news is that every single story, they act like it's the first time it's happened. Like, all of cable news is basically Miranda from The Tempest, and they're all like, oh, brave new world with such people in it. They're all surprised every single time everything happens over and over again. And it's like one of the most frustrating aspects about that medium, because there is no grounding in history. There's no grounding in what happened 5 minutes ago. So as a caveat, or maybe as an addendum to what I was saying earlier about trying to stay ahead of the curve of the news cycle, one way to do it, yes, is by listening to people and believing them when they tell you what they're about to do. Another key aspect of that, though, is to know what they've done before. Just to simply remember what happened yesterday or 2 months ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago, because all of it happens again and again and again and again and again in just slightly different iterations. Nothing is new. Nothing is new, right? And so being a news person that understands nothing is new just gives you a leg up on other people, because you can always kind of ground what's going on now into what happened before. And that's how you know what's going to happen next, right? One of my favorite little brain facts is that the part of your brain that predicts the future is the hypothalamus, is the part of your brain that remembers things. It's the same part. It's doing the same thing. Predicting the future is actually just remembering the past and making kind of smart extrapolations on it. And that's a lot of what journalism is to simply remember what happened and to put it in context as the new aspect or iteration of it happens again and again and again. So yes, I think history is critically, having some understanding of history, especially on whatever your beat is critically important. And I'll just say also this for younger people trying to break into some of these things. One of the ways you can establish yourself on a beat and establish yourself as an expert in the ways that we were talking about earlier is to have that knowledge of other things that have happened in your beat in the past, right? Like, if you can be the person in your organization or even on your social media feeds or whatever who takes a new piece of information in this industry or issue that you've decided to care about and can just link it with some piece of information that happened, again, 2 months ago, 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, like, you immediately become a person other people recognize as, oh, maybe that person knows something. And it's just by understanding the past, remembering it, and knowing how to tie it into what's happening in the present.
Do things together.
Yeah, and I think, building off of this, it's a self-corrective, because when you are right in the mix of a story or right in the mix of a beat, it's very, very easy. It doesn't matter how well educated you are, how well read you are. It doesn't matter how many people you talk to. It's very, very easy to get carried away by the uniqueness of your particular story. So writing about Donald Trump, for example, it's extraordinarily easy to, look at him and you see this vile homunculus of a human being, and you see him spewing all kinds of, bile out into the atmosphere. And you see him beating up on vulnerable people. And it's very, very easy to say, oh my God, this is the worst that's ever happened. Well, there are many reasons that you can make a pretty cogent argument that Trump is the worst president in American history. But the idea that he's the first demagogue in American history, well, that's nonsense. Trump was actually taught his public speaking by a man called Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn was the right-hand man of a man called Joe McCarthy, who was, a complete and utter demagogue, just as awful as Donald Trump. He just didn't have access to Twitter and to social media. You could look at Donald Trump's family separation policy and you could say, this is heinous. It's against the American way. Well, it is heinous. It's an absolutely horrible thing, but it's not against the American way, because you can go back time and time and time again in American history and see families separated, Native Americans separated from children in schooling systems, people thrown over the border summarily, slavery, of course. I mean, you can just go time and again into American history, and you see that what we're seeing today are cadences and variations on a melody of what's happened in the past. So my take would be, the single most, much more important than becoming a specialist in history or in politics or the law or economics or, whatever your specialty beat is, the single most important thing you can do to render yourself more credible as a journalist is to learn history and to read it voraciously, not just sort of dip in and out, but to read, I read at least as much history as I do journalism. And, most of my colleagues, I would assume it's the same thing, that, just read about the American story. I do want to come to a question from another John Towson. And this one is much more focused on a particular event. And John's question is, what did you think of the CNN forum with Trump? And how do you think the media can responsibly cover a Trump campaign in 2024?
Joan?
Joan, kick it off. It was a freaking nightmare. It never should have happened the way it did. I mean, I'm not going to get into Caitlin Collins and her skills or lack thereof. I think she's plenty skilled. But you cannot hand him a microphone and also a younger woman to beat up in front of an audience that you already guaranteed was full of Trumpers. That we know how that ends. She's a nasty woman. I could go on and on, but I've written about it, so I'm just not. How we cover him, I'm not sure. The nation is not being offered town halls with Donald Trump. I'm sure we would say no. But in terms of you cannot put him on live. If you want to host your own thing, which I guess some of them do, you tape it and you fact check it in a way that poor Caitlin Collins couldn't. But I think that, I think we all know the sad thing is that poor Chris Licht, the new head of CNN, had no idea he did have it. He knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing.
He absolutely knew what he was doing. He's just flailing. He's not succeeding at his job. So that's what happened. I'm the one often who says to my team, I'm going to take it. Elie owes me at least 3 or 4 drinks for, covering some Trump thing. So we have to cover him. But in terms of live television, no. You can't do it that way. If you do it at all, you tape it, you stop it, you have, me and Elie, ideally, fact check him and say the bullshit that he's saying. But they're not going to do that. And I think they're all going to fight over him. And them. I guess Jake Tapper, who I'm just going to say, he's a friend of mine. I hired him long ago at Salon. I love him. He's going to do something with Nikki Haley. I don't think that's any better, except she doesn't talk as fast and she won't call him nasty and humiliate him. So you just have to change the way you do things and not do anything live.
I would just add, look, that there is a liberal media is a myth.
Right.
We don't have a liberal media. We have a corporate media, and that corporate media is going to do the things that they can figure out how to do. They're going to get ratings, that are going to get advertising dollars, and is going to make them money. Most of the people who are running most of the organizations you watch or read every day are rich white men with rich white male politics and all that entails. These are the kinds of people, the people who greenlit the town hall, the CNN town hall, are exactly the kind of people who Trump was not going to attack. He wasn't going to call them a nasty woman. He wasn't going to defame them. He wasn't going to rape them. So that's one of the reasons why they put him on. Okay, and then you see that throughout the media. One of the reasons why I work for the Nation and not someplace else is that the people who own the Nation want my policy positions to succeed. And that would not be true if I worked for many other organizations. Granted, don't get me wrong, I got a price. I mean, I got mortgages, and you can pay me to make some sacrifices. But if it's all equal, all else being equal, of course I'm going to work for an organization that actually wants me and my people to succeed, which is the antithesis of what corporate media is. They don't want people like me and my ideas to succeed, which is why you get things like the Trump town hall, which is why you get writ large the New York Times today. Like it's the same kind of thought process. So whenever you see something happening in the media, you're like, oh, why is that going on that way? Follow the money. Follow the money, and it all leads back into a rich white male's pocket. And once you understand that, you're going to understand a lot more about why you read what you read and why you see what you see.
And I think, there was widespread condemnation of CNN, and it wasn't just from the Nation magazine.
No.
That
from CNN
was broadly panned by everybody, including CNN's own journalists, as being a complete fiasco. There's a lot of audience interest in this topic about how to cover Trump. So I do want to move on to another question. And this one is from Hannah Langenfeld. And Hannah asked a question saying, there was so much coverage about Trump and how it influences voters by giving him a platform to spread factually inaccurate information. But her question is, how can the news and how can reporters within the news balance between being fair to all candidates and also not furthering the spreading of actually false misinformation ahead of the election? Now, Joan, you talked about this a little bit about going away from these live town hall things, but more generally, in this world where there's deep fakes, where there's artificial intelligence and misinformation, where there's Trump sort of learning how to sort of be ever more malicious in his stirring of the pot, given all of these, how do you cover the election fairly?
You cover it more slowly. You just have to slow down, which is not any of our metabolisms, even some older folks. I mean, we are still like, oh my God. I mean, we email each other at the Nation and we're like, oh shit. Sorry, guys. It's usually me, because I don't know why I'm always watching TV. And I'm like, you guys, this just happened. And what are we going to do? And who's going to write about it? I'm going to stop doing that. We've got to slow down. We've got to pick and choose our topics. And as I said before, we've got to cover Trump. Sadly, we've got to cover Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. But we can't keep doing it as though it's all urgent. I mean, it is urgent, but as though everything's going to change if we don't cover it right now. I mean, yes, maybe we will be scooped. We don't worry about that so much at the Nation, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we feel like we should get something up before other, progressive thought leader publications get something up. But in general, we don't have to do that. And I have just told myself that we all have to slow down and we have to talk to more people. And whether it's DeSantis or Trump or Haley or RFK Jr., I don't want to bring that up, but I will, because that's happening. We just have to treat it with the seriousness it requires and debunk the things that need to be debunked. And I just feel like that's what's gotten lost in this this world in which we can post at any minute. I can go on Twitter right now and say, you will not believe what Elie Mystal just said. It's so outrageous, or I could just post on The Nation and, within 45 minutes. And this is a bad thing that happened. And I was there for it at Salon, especially. So I think that's part of it, Elie.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, look, as the person who doesn't cover the man unless I have to, like, I'm just talking out my ass a little bit here, but at 30,000 feet, it's not that hard to me because I've also know how to cover a disease, right? How do you cover a sewage leak, right? Like, it's important. Sewage leaks are really important in your town, right? That's going to ruin people's days. It's going to be, right? And so you have to cover it. If there's sewage in your town streets, you're going to cover it. You're going to cover it obsessively until it's gone. But what you're not going to do is pretend like there are two sides to whether or not poop should be in the streets, right? You're going to start your coverage from the presumption that poop in the streets is bad. How do we get rid of this poop in the streets? Whose fault is it for putting this poop in the streets? Why do some people seem to be bathing in the poop? Can we help them? I don't know. But what we never do is be like, maybe the poop has a point. Yeah. Never. That never happens on sewage leak coverage. That never happens on disease coverage. Maybe the cancer is here to help us. No. How do we stop the cancer is always the coverage, right? What is the cure? What is the latest idea to stop this cancer from ravaging our communities is always the point of the coverage. So too must it be with Trump, DeSantis, MAGA, and all of the clear and present threats to democracy. And that's not hard. It is not hard to do your journalism from a decidedly pro-democracy standpoint. And the fact that a lot of the Republican Party cannot meet that objectively pro-democracy standpoint does not say anything about your objectivity. It says everything about where that party is right now and where they will continue to be as long as we continue to normalize the poop that they put in our streets.
I just want to point out, I don't think I can put it in our chat, but there was an amazing TikTok where someone pretended to be a Fox News producer covering a mass shooting. And what they all decided was, we need the point of view of the gun. Nobody has ever gotten the point of view of the gun that killed all these people. And that's what Elie just reminded me of. I think we should, I'm going to go interview the poop next time,
I don't know if I like the direction this conversation's going in, but all right. Listen, we have a few questions that I didn't have time for. So I want to apologize to Maddie Park, to Kenneth Woods, to Bryce Hurd, to Emma Dinsmore, and to Zuri Pope. Your questions are great, and I wish we had another half hour so that I could have them all addressed. That said, we are plumb out of time here. So we have about 45 seconds left. I've had a great time on this panel. Joan, Elie, it's a delight to be with you again. Do either of you have any closing words you want to hand off to this audience before we call it a night?
I would just say, send me, I probably can find them, but send me the questions and I'll try to answer them for people. Send me the questions that we haven't answered, because this has been a great crowd.
I second what Joan says, and I will just add, don't let these fools scare you. Just don't, whatever, if you want to be a journalist, you cannot be a journalist while being afraid. So don't let the fear take you. Do write your truth, report on the stories that you think are important, and let other people assess whether or not that was the right way to do it, because maybe you will be part of a paradigm shift that changes the right way to do it.
Well, on that note, onwards and upwards. And I wish I could see all the students in the audience, but I know you're out there and I know you're a great crowd. So take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Cheers.
I
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Elie, and thank you, Joan. Thank you all in the crowd. We really appreciate you spending your Saturday with us. I know there are other things you could have done, but we're grateful for your engagement, your interest, your talent, the work you're undertaking, and all the terrific questions. I mean, really, I will, Joan, I hope she doesn't regret saying that. We will definitely send on the questions. I've actually been promising it. There are a lot of questions we've left on the table, if you will, at all the different sessions. And so we will be collecting those. We'll be sending an email to everyone with links to these sessions, with information on how you can apply for an internship, how you can write for Student Nation, and a measure of the success of this conference is really how well we all stay connected. So all of you, again, thank you again. Please stay well and please stay in touch. Thank you.